What happens when you try to enforce 1930-era laws in a modern and democratic society? Are constitutional rights infringed? Can the president declare a state of emergency in relation to COVID-19 in Guyana? What can the government do in their addressing the COVID-19 crisis to instill confidence in Guyanese citizens? Stay tuned to find out. My fellow Guyanese, my name is Brendan Glassford and you are tuned in to Clarity, where we provide clarity on legal issues that you have questions about. Now, before we begin, allow me to say this is an educational discussion. It is not legal advice, nor is it a substitute for legal advice. Now, with that out of the way, let's address the legal issues that you have questions about. Last time we discussed the provisions of the Public Health Ordinance and the Quarantine Ordinance, and how it could be used to assist the government and public health authorities in order to contain the spread of an infectious disease such as COVID-19. One thing that must be remembered is that the provisions of the Public Health Ordinance and the Quarantine Ordinance were drafted in a much different world. They were drafted in the 1930s and 1940s. The world, democracy, the law and constitutions have gone forward leaps and bounds since then. I don't think there were many, if any, written constitutions at that time. I don't think people expected to have access to or had access to as many rights as they do today. So the measures that have been put forward in those pieces of legislation would seem extremely draconian and harsh, heavy-handed to most people in today's society. What happens if we try to apply the provisions of those ordinances in a modern day setting with constitutional rights entitled to every Guyanese citizen? The government of Guyana has actually gazetted an order on the 16th of March 2020 to empower the Minister of Health to take action under the Public Health Ordinance. Many of the same provisions that I had outlined in the last episode, save and except a few modifications which we'll have to address at a later time. What we want to focus on today is how the constitutional provisions, specifically the fundamental right provisions, would interact with the government exercising powers under the Public Health Ordinance. So the government has outlined a slew of measures which it will take under the authority of the Public Health Ordinance. These include isolation, segregation, removal of individuals who are infected with COVID-19 or are suspected to be infected with COVID-19. They will also exercise the power of inspection and visitation of premises, and they have also indicated that no large gatherings are to happen during at least a 2-week period. So these measures proposed by the government could affect the fundamental rights that Guyanese citizens are guaranteed by the Constitution. Now, the fundamental rights that are most likely to be affected are protection of freedom of movement, protection of freedom of expression, protection of freedom of conscience, the right against arbitrary search and seizure, and the freedom to associate and demonstrate. These rights are guaranteed, but like every fundamental right, there are exceptions to these rights. Now, all the rights that were just listed have one exception in common, and that is, if action is taken under any law of Guyana, it shall not be held inconsistent with any of these rights once it is reasonably required for public health, at least in this instance. Now, what this means is that what would normally be a breach of your fundamental rights can be condoned once it is in the interest of public health. Now, it seems like the government can just do whatever they want. Given this exception, that is not the case, because it is still open to citizens to go to the High Court either after the fact, if they feel that they have been wronged by the actions of the government, to sue the government for damages and get declarations that their fundamental rights were breached, or it is open to judicial review as the process is going on. So for instance, if that person has been removed to a hospital for treatment and they were not sick, then a lawyer could conceivably go to court for judicial review to get that person released. So I know this will give you little comfort, but citizens can go to court after the fact if they feel that their fundamental rights were wrongly breached and it was not reasonably required for public health. We may not like the content of these provisions, but they are the letter of the Constitution. And of course, it is for the court to interpret and see if they have been properly applied. Now, the final thing that we have to discuss is a state of emergency. Article 150 of the Constitution does allow the president to declare a state of emergency or a state of war. Now, in this case, where an infectious disease is concerned, the president could, by proclamation, declare a state of emergency. That state of emergency would only last 14 days unless Parliament decides to increase that time. Now, at this time, we do not have an active Parliament, but conceivably, they could be called out to do so. Now, that would require support from government MPs and opposition MPs. In the state of emergency, a proclamation of emergency having been declared, it would give the government sweeping powers to suspend all constitutional fundamental rights if that is what they felt was in the best interest of dealing with the situation. It would also allow them to take whatever steps were reasonably required or justifiable to deal with the situation and bring it to an end. Even in principle, giving a government that much power without accountability is a scary prospect. Now, of course, we come again to these words, reasonably required or reasonably justified. Now, that would mean that at some point they might have to account before the court for those actions that they have taken. If they have breached people's rights and it was not in the best interest, if it was not for the purpose of dealing with the situation for which the government had declared a state of emergency, then the court could hold them accountable and they may face coercive orders or have to pay out monetary compensation. In essence, the president could proclaim a state of emergency, but without the resolution of Parliament to take it further than 14 days, it could only continue for 14 days. And even if Parliament was to agree to take it past 14 days, it could last for a period of 6 months. Now, the government is supposed to exercise the powers it has been given in the best interest of the people. Now, part of that is fostering and developing public confidence in their actions. Nobody likes to be on the receiving end of coercive and broad powers, but I suspect that if people knew that it was for the greater good, in the best interest of the longevity of Guyana and its people, then the populace would not have such a great issue with the government exercising powers. In addressing a public health crisis, such as the pandemic that is COVID-19, now no one likes to be on the receiving end of any draconian or coercive power. But where infectious diseases are concerned, swift and stringent action must be taken, especially with contagious diseases such as Ebola, SARS, and now COVID-19. We cannot pretend that COVID-19 does not have a mortality rate, which is higher than the common cold or the flu. And the human resource is the most important resource. If the government does not have the tools to effectively combat the spread of an infectious disease such as COVID-19, it could have disastrous effects. All you need to do is look at the numbers coming out of Italy every day. Hundreds dead, thousands sick, and the numbers just seem to be climbing. So Ghana does not want to end up in a situation like that. But the government also has to have regard in its efforts to contain that to be able to effectively exercise these efforts, it must have full public confidence behind its actions. We cannot pretend that Guyana is a country without ethnic and political strife. In the particular political situation which we now find ourselves in, the best way to instill confidence in every Guyanese is if the government and the opposition hold hands, agree on the way forward in combating and containing the spread of COVID-19. So I hope we've given you clarity on these legal issues. Until next time, take care.